It was a dark and stormy night. Now, who could resist not using that as an opening to a talk? You do it with almost without needing a reason. The words were first written by the British novelist, poet and politician Edward Bulwer Lytton. And as I say, I used the words with the slightest of reason. His grandson was Neville Lytton, a staff officer on Sir Douglas Haig's general headquarters in France. Lytton was born into a social system that Charles Bean, the subject of my talk, abhorred. But he was a remarkable and interesting man in his own right, and someone whose company Bean enjoyed. Lytton certainly had some amazing credentials. He was the son of a former Viceroy of India. He'd won a bronze medal at the 1908 London Olympics. He was a writer and a gifted artist, and some of his war paintings of the First War are in important collections. I'll indulge myself a little bit further with Lytton. His family tree also held some amazing characters. His sister was Lady Constance Bulwer Lytton, the militant suffragette. Another sister married Edward Lutyens, the architect, amongst whose memorials he built the Australian National Memorial at Villa-Bretonneux. And another sister was married to the Prime Minister's brother. As an army officer, Lytton had served at the front before joining Haig's staff, whereas he was put in charge of the foreign press section. In 1917, he took over as head of the main press section at GHQ. In this role, he was basically the head censor and the public relations officer, using a modern term. Not really one of the professional military caste, Lytton was liberal in his views of censorship. It might surprise people to imagine liberal censors during the First World War. Being the Australian official war correspondent, often found him supportive rather than a hindrance, and they had a very good relationship. In 1920, Lytton wrote of his wartime work, and in one part he wrote, "Attached to the Colonial Corps there were correspondents. I became a very close personal friend of Mr. Bean from Australia, whom I had the greatest admiration. Here again the task of a correspondent who only had to write about the operations of one corps was much easier, but to give first-rate accounts of operations is never easy. Mr. Bean's cables were perfect. He would watch a battle from a shell hole with a notebook in hand, and he would describe the special features of each fight like an impressionist painter." I'll come back to Lytton later. Over the past year, or longer, I have been engaged in the work on Charles Bean's diaries and have edited the Western Front series for publication, hopefully next year. As many here will likely know, these diaries and notebooks, mostly small but dense with information and very hard to read, were maintained solidly throughout the war, and they became the basis of much of Bean's later writing. He regarded them as his chief record and the foundation of the official history that he anticipated writing once the war was over. I'll stress that I'm not writing a biography of Bean. He's already been well served in that regard. I have been asked by a few people from time to time if after spending so much time reading his diaries, I feel I know the man. Well, I certainly know him better now. However, in truth, I can only say I got to know the man that he was during the First World War. Charles Bean was not cast in stone. I'm very much aware that, like all of us, he developed, grew and changed in his thinking over his lifetime. His wartime diary entries, usually written at the end of a long day, often revealed the thoughts of a man who was often tired, sometimes frustrated, occasionally emotional, and possibly shocked. He would live on in later years to change his mind about some things, revise his opinions, review his comments, or grow stronger in some of his views. His diaries too weren't written in stone. In the decades after the war, he sometimes would add little notes or annotations to them, so they remained a living document throughout his lifetime. Let me offer an example that did cause me some confusion. Following Sir John Monash's appointment to command the Australian Corps in 1918, Bean had written in his diary, "Monash had, I was sure, worked for this job by all sorts of clever, well-hidden subterranean channels." In 1956, 34 years later, reviewing his comment, he was said to have written alongside that, "I do not now believe this to be true." This little exchange between himself has been quoted in numerous publications over the years. However, when looking for the comment, I was initially disturbed to find that it does not exist in the original diaries. Did he write it at all? This was a puzzle that was last sorted out when he finally discovered that he had indeed written the 1956 entry, but on a photocopy of the original page that was amongst his working papers. So if you go through the original diary, you don't find it, but he nevertheless did write it. Now, there are a number of thoughts that came to him while doing this work, and I'll offer a few of them. Take, for instance, his appointment. What a brilliant selection that was. What great guiding hand or wonderful stroke of luck or genius led the Australian Journalists Association in 1914 to nominate Charles Bean ahead of Keith Murdoch for the position of Australian official war correspondent. I think we sometimes need to think about that. Yeah. Both men were qualified for selection, yet the choice of Bean over Murdoch would bring results that could not have been imagined then. The war would change both men's lives. For Murdoch, it set a course that would lead him to further influence and fame and fortune. For Bean, the appointment meant a lifetime of dedicated hard work and searing memories. His name would be forever connected to Australians' experience of the Great War and its commemoration. For him, the war never ended, occupying the rest of his life. What Australia got when Bean accepted the appointment was someone prepared to devote his life to the task. Who else would have done that? Certainly not Murdoch. Any knowledge of Keith Murdoch tells us he would not have stayed at the task for long. He would have written some good, strong, nationalistic and exciting press releases, such as we know he could, but I doubt that he would have stuck to the job. He certainly would not have written an official history. He never wrote a book in his life. And we would not have had the Australian War Memorial. Murdoch went to the war as a commercial correspondent. The two had met briefly on Gallipoli and were often together in London and on the Western Front. I actually was surprised to see how much they did keep company, and some issues brought them quite close. Another thought I will offer. Being there was something that Bean made a habit of. I won't go into details, but you know, even on the convoy to Egypt, HMAS Sydney is diverted to engage the Emden, the German raider, and destroyed it. Now, Bean had seen the building of HMAS Sydney when he was working in London before the war, and he was a great enthusiast for the Navy. He was going to write a book about the Navy, presumably the Royal Navy, during the war, but never found time. And there he was, you know, as close as you could be to a great naval victory. He was there on the 25th of April 1915 when Anzac troops landed on Gallipoli. He was there on May the 2nd when he was there in May when the 2nd Australian Brigade, briefly detached from the others, attacked at Krithia. He was present at the attack of Lone Pine, and soon afterwards, further away, he was so close to the action that he was wounded. But when he got to France, he missed the Battle of Fromelles on the 19th of July. It was the Australians' first big battle on the Western Front. However, typically, he was there the following morning moving amongst the survivors and getting their stories. It was more than 2 years later before he had the chance to walk over the battlefields of Fromelles once the Germans had been driven from that ground. And that's where he was on the 11th of November 1918, the day the war ended, still at work. But back to 1916. A few days after the Battle of Fromelles, on the 23rd of July, Bean was on the ground and sometimes in the trenches during the 7 weeks that the Australians, the 3 divisions of them, were in the Battle of Pozieres. Pozieres shook Bean up. It was a terrible experience for everyone, and the heavy losses almost broke the back of the all-volunteer AIF. The Australians had made 19 attacks, most of which in modern-day circumstances would be called battles themselves. Over these weeks, they lost 23,000 men. Most of the casualties were caused by intense artillery fire. Shrapnel tore men to pieces, high explosives blew them to bits. And all the time the ground was turned over by shell fire and dusted with the grey powder of explosive residue. Bean's own cousin, Lieutenant Leo Butler, was killed there, and Bean was there when they buried him. Bean never forgot Pozieres, and it is interesting to see that once the Germans had moved on, he often returned to visit the site of this fighting, more than anywhere else. On one visit towards the end of the war, he commented solemnly, "Pozieres is one vast Australian cemetery." After the war, Bean would pen the words for the memorial that stands at the windmill there today. The ruins of Pozieres windmill, which lie here, was the centre of the struggle on this part of the Somme battlefield in July and August 1916. It was captured on August the 4th by Australian troops who fell more thickly on this ridge than any other battlefield of the war. You can say any other battlefield of the world. He also proposed the Australian government purchase some of this ground. This was during the war. This did later happen, but many years later, and it was the Australian War Memorial that made the purchase. On Pozieres, Bean found that he could not work in the front line in quite the same manner as he was able to on Gallipoli. And after all, there was not a lot to be seen at the battlefield while wearing a gas hood or while huddled tense with fear in the bottom of a smoke-filled trench as shells crashed above and around. In later battles, Bean usually got close to the action and the danger, but distant enough to gain a view of what was going on. On 4 July 1918, for the Battle of Hamel, he took up a high spot north of the Somme River, actually in the British sector, to get a broad view of the Australian front. This was pretty much the same spot that he watched the opening of the offensive on the 8th of August. I always find it interesting, he reveals in the diary that on that great battle, watching that great battle, he sent off 2 dispatches. We forget that he's a journalist at this stage, a war correspondent. He's sending off dispatches. He's typing whilst the battle is still in progress to get the first one away. But too often on the Western Front, the action was on such a wide frontage that he could only gain local impressions. Still, these experiences were memorable and important for his work. For a while, Bean had an assistant official correspondent to relieve his work pressure. That was Fred Cutlack. That was until Cutlack was injured in a motorcycle accident. I need to mention too, John Treloar, a young officer, headed the Australian War Records section and got to work closely with Bean. These and other men retained a close association in various capacities with him long after the war. One important figure who Bean's diaries draws out from the shadows is H.C. Smart. Henry Casimir Smart was an Australian journalist friend who Bean had known from their days together in London before the war. Smart had worked in Sydney, he was born in Sydney, had worked in Sydney and in Asia, and had served in the Boer War. In London, he worked as a promotion officer at the Australian High Commission. Bean thought him the most able person there. In 1915, there were already many men in the AIF in Britain. Most were casualties from the Gallipoli campaign. Smart set up the Australian Military Office as part of the High Commission to help keep account of these men, and the officers took over large premises in Horseshoe Road. Once the AIF shifted to the Western Front, these premises were expanded to become the AIF administrative headquarters. Smart introduced Bean to the work of Sir Max Aitken, later to become Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian-born newspaper millionaire whose talents and connections the Canadian government harnessed to promote and record its troops' war efforts. And remember that the Canadians had been on the Western Front earlier than the Australians. Smart and Bean set about introducing something similar for Australia. Smart helped Bean publish his famous Anzac book, which had been compiled on Gallipoli. Smart edited the Anzac Bulletin and had an important part in selecting Australian war artists and photographers and in the creation of the Australian War Records section. Bean worked with him on this. It eventually led to Australia retaining its own war records and being responsible for their preservation, to the creation of the Australian War Memorial and to the publication of the official histories. Harry Gullet was an Australian journalist who Bean knew well. In the golden years before the war, they were all working in London, Smart, Gullet and Bean and others, and they would meet regularly as part of an expatriate social set. Harry was a war correspondent on the Western Front even before Bean served there. He was at that time reporting on British troops in action. He later went back to Australia and returned as a member of the AIF. He then joined the Australian War Records section. In 1917, Gullet urged Bean to concentrate his efforts on the official history he would write once the war was over, rather than his war correspondent dispatches and other work. And there is a time you can almost see Bean no longer being the war correspondent, but becoming the historian, and he's keeping notes for after the war. Gullet would return to Australia to write Gullet would go on to become the official Australian war correspondent in Palestine. After the war, he joined Bean's team in writing the official histories. He would write the volume about the light horse in Palestine. They and their families remained very close friends. Gullet would return to Australia to write his history, and for a brief period was the first director of the Australian War Museum. He would enter federal politics and become an important support for Bean in the Parliament. He died alongside General Sir Brudnell White, the Australian general that Bean most admired, in a disastrous plane crash in Canberra in 1940. Bean felt the loss of both men deeply. Bean was familiar with past official war histories, but he was envisaging something different. He planned to write from the private soldiers' level upwards as much as from the commanders' viewpoints. He wanted his books to be available and to be in the homes of returned soldiers and the general public. He believed that his presence at battles was vital to his understanding of them. However, once the scale of modern warfare became evident, he increasingly discovered the need to maintain extensive and accurate records, and he would dig deep into these in the decades that followed the war. Interestingly, Bean's wartime diaries reveal that additional authors were being considered to write further official volumes on technical, tactical and logistical aspects of the war, and possibly chaplains. These volumes, apart from the 3 volumes of medical history by Graham Butler, never eventuated. And there actually were a couple of meetings held to consider authors for these volumes we never got to see. Bean worked largely to his own concept of what was required. His August 1917 diary contains an interesting exchange between General Charteris, the Chief Officer of Intelligence on Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig's General Headquarters. Charteris was the man at the desk where the buck stopped as far as censorship was concerned. And he would suffer the consequences eventually for that too, but that's another story. Charteris said to Bean, "You know, no history that you can write can be of any importance except purely locally. That cannot be written from here at the war. The real history will be written by someone right away from the war where Fortescue is. Your history cannot have the same value as the sort of history he will write." Now, Charteris was right in some respects. Bean would discover that the history would have to be written in Australia after the war, and the records would be central to this, and it would take a long time. Charteris was wrong in anointing Sir John Fortescue as the man to do it for Britain. Fortescue was a leading military historian whose multi-volume history of the British Army was written between 1899 and 1930. Sir John did start to write the British official history of the First World War, but that proved to be beyond him. His work was abandoned and passed over to others to do. Bean responded to Charteris' comments. He said, "I replied that I realised the difficulty and I realised I might not finish this war alive. But if I did, I felt I was in a position in which scarcely any historian of a war had ever been, that of a man who will write about war which he has seen all through, in which he has been in every important trench and seen almost every important event." Photography was one tool that Bean felt was essential to what he was doing. At this time, most war photography was for public information, the newspapers and/or propaganda. Of course, cameras in those days were much more unwieldy affairs than what we're familiar with today. Most of the official photographers preferred to compose their pictures, which Bean regarded as faking. He was a bit severe in his judgment, overlooking the fact that the camera cannot catch everything the way the human eye sees it. Some of the works by the war photographers have become classics of their genre and priceless insights into the nature of the First World War. But for Bean, the quest was for absolute accuracy and honesty rather than artistry. By 1917, Bean was severely overworked and was seeking a break. Back in Australia, the public was getting war-weary too. War correspondence stories no longer had the impact they once did. The public was becoming sceptical of newspaper reports. It was the casualty lists that were doing the talking. Bean was critical of some of the other war correspondence work. He complained that generally the press only wanted sensation and the government mostly propaganda. He rejected the idea of doing that sort of work, but it did hurt him to learn that fewer papers were taking his dispatches. And we do have to understand that most reports of the war back in the Australian newspapers were not being written by Bean. In May 1918, a friend from before the war, Lieutenant Edward Brissenden, a Sydney barrister serving in the AIF, challenged Bean that he had not yet written about the life of the ordinary soldier. Bean accepted the comment and he wrote in his diary, "Well, I don't know that life. I've done my work from outside as a staff officer, as it were. I don't know if I should have mixed with him more freely if the unpopularity which I had gained at Mina in Egypt had not made me shirk from living among the men. Anyway, I'm too self-conscious to mix well with a great number of men." But Bean met Brissenden's challenge by observing closely the behaviour of troops in the adjoining billet, those living in the barns and the lofts at Brewery Farm at Quirriu on the Somme. He wrote a comprehensive description of the men and their ordinary activities in his diary, which I find possibly the most engaging read of them all. Here he was actually writing for the history, not for the newspapers. And in the final volume of the 6 volumes that he later wrote, the first chapter, titled The Diggers, 1918, he reproduces his description almost word for word from the diary. Although Australian-born, Bean received most of his education in Britain. He loved all that was best of England. And he doesn't say Britain, he always says England. And he believed in empire. But he was also proudly Australian. He saw great deficiencies in Britain, and most particularly in its social structure. He opposed the aristocracy and the monarchy. In later years, he refused to accept a knighthood. He said, and a couple of times in his diary he says that he was a revolutionary, his word, and he hoped that the war might bring social change to Britain. It did bring some, but not as much as he was hoping. A typical, and I've got here, a typical rant, and it was, from one of his diaries. "The British soldier and staff cannot stand up to the Germans. The real cause is the social system of England. This system is necessary to the development of the national wealth, which means the wealth of the upper and middle classes. The other class, though an Englishman would wonder what you meant if you said so, has no rights. Generals without brains and an army without physique. And there you have it." That's in his diary in April 1918. Now, I go back to the fact, he's writing this in a diary when he's feeling exhausted, and the time he's writing that is when the British Army is seemingly collapsing in front of the German 1918 advance. But nevertheless. So with that context, let's turn our attention back to where I started with Neville Lytton. He wrote the following about Bean in 1920. Lytton says, Bean, his great personal courage made him respected by everyone. Outside his own special work, he had many great qualities, and he thought deeply on all human tendencies. He told me that the Australians had the highest admiration for our Navy. Well, Bean certainly did. They admired our Guard division, but thought that the Prussian discipline the Prussian discipline typical of the Guards, the British Guards, did not produce such fine fighters as the Australians' elasticity. They thought that the average Tommy was disgracefully servile, and that his extreme obedience killed all cleverness and originality. Being himself felt that many of our British important appointments were made through influence and class preference, and that we were too content to put up with second-rate men in high places when first-rate ones were available all the time. He continues, to my mind though, Bean had one fault, namely that he was too partial to his countrymen. But it was a high-minded patriotism, and I must admit that most of his criticisms of the mother country were justified. I'll add this little bit too. Lytton continues. I wish that some of our big lecture associations would invite him over here and ask him to tell the British public throughout the land what he told me in our conversations. Bean is now writing a history of the Australian achievements in the war, which will be one of the most interesting of all war books, for he has seen and felt. Lytton goes on to offer some very general comments on historians. I've just included these for what they're worth. He says, we make a great mistake in choosing historians who work solely from documents. That's rather hurtful, isn't it? The French know this. They appoint officers who in civil life followed the profession of letters, and they were attached to the staff of armies, only after having experience of frontline work. Our British correspondents were obliged to collect information from the staff officers of armies or corps, and during offensives this was not always quite convenient. Anyway, Charles Bean went on to see the Australian War Memorial open in Canberra in 1941, and the following year he published the final volume as official history. These were his two great triumphs. But it must be remembered that he had faced many disappointments along the way. I think from this point in history we look back and we think, oh, the Australians came back from the war, published their official history and built the Australian War Memorial. But there were long years in between those accomplishments. He faithfully served his nation in war, and then he faced the long, hard fight to see his vision realised. Other men might and probably would have given up. We can look at what other nations did to preserve the memory of their troops, but no single figure emerges to rival what Charles Bean did for Australia. If we were to put a list of his characteristics, there'd be many, but I would, in thinking about it, probably underline persistence. He devoted his whole life to providing for us the legacy of the Australian War Memorial and the official history of Australia in the War of 1914-18. Thank you.
Question. Andrew Richardson, Army History Unit. Thank you, Peter. In your opinion, is there anything that Bean wrote in his diary about Australian command operations that was not included in the volumes of the official history that particularly surprised you?
I can't think of anything. In his diary, there's a lot of his operational stuff in the diaries, in fact I'm not including, simply because his more refined comments emerge in the official histories. You find a few prejudices and personal opinions in there, and I dare say if you're looking for what you mentioned, you'll find it. But overall, the diaries are that evening's impressions. Some of these comments often aren't worth very much. He's off on some tangent. They're very useful in some of the personal profiles he forms, but even then, that's that evening's impression. We mentioned Walter Dexter. His first encounter with Walter Dexter, he thinks the man's a buffoon, because he just mixes with the man and he's coarse and not spiritual. Within months he's writing about this man's a saint. a godlike figure, you know. So you see these things emerging, but no, I don't think it's strong on operational material, to answer in short, yeah. Mm.
Yep. Tony.
Tony Hastings. It was interesting that you mentioned that Bean felt shy about mixing with ordinary soldiers. I haven't read Bean from cover to cover, but I've read fair slabs of it. And one of the things that strikes me is that when you're looking at the footnotes, yes, he does mention, privates and corporals and sergeants, but overwhelmingly those personal footnotes seem to be of officers, albeit many of them are junior officers, lieutenants and captains and so on. Bean seems to have a reputation for being very egalitarian, but to me that doesn't really seem to come across when you look at the work more closely. Would you agree with that?
No, I think he was extremely egalitarian. His own personal shyness was, just part of his makeup. No, he had enormous admiration for the ordinary man, not just the ordinary soldier, but the ordinary bushman, stockman, ringer, that he was dealing with before the war too, because Bean was much closer to the Australian countryside than we imagine, and he always saw things from that level. I think it's one of the great things. We talk about how did the Bean, was he disillusioned during the First World War? He was disillusioned after the war, because the social scene, around the world and in Australia, never came up to what he hoped it would be, and his dreams were very egalitarian. No, I wouldn't agree with that at all. Yeah. Mm.
Martin Ball. I'd actually like to echo that comment, because I remember reading the account of the Neck, for example, where 234 soldiers died. He lists the name of every single officer and none of the men who died.
Oh,
I'm not sure that it necessarily relates to that sense of not being able to mix with the men. I think it's just more, that's the way it was done. You mentioned the officers' names and you didn't mention the men, but I think there's something to be said about that. Often the officers get a lot more prominence than an individual soldier. Not to say that, of course, he doesn't mention a lot of privates as well.
He mentions a lot. I can't agree. I mean, I've written a lot of stuff for Australian Dictionary Biography, and I know in some of the book reviews they will say they only ever mentioned important people, not ordinary people. Well, that's because there's no story in writing about ordinary people who just like to go fishing on the weekend and watch a certain range of TV programs. It's harder. If you're writing about a battle, it's the officers that have the impact on the battle. Bean mentions private soldiers a lot, and I don't know, put it in this context, which other military official history mentions them more than Bean? None. He's far way out there. I don't think, I've never looked, but I would confidently say a private soldier doesn't get mentioned in any volumes of the British official history of the war. In contrast, Bean mentions in hundreds. Yeah. So, okay. I mean, now, was someone who wrote a book on the Neck who mentioned every man that died, I think I can still see where Bean was coming from, because the formations that charged were built around these officers, and they're part of the structure of the attack.
Time for one more. Andrew, go on, nobody else.
If there's no question.
Yeah, in that case, I'd like Andrew David.
I'm David Horn. I'm only speaking about because it seems like the questions might have died down, but I can't help commenting on that issue that's just been mentioned. I wrote a book about the SAS, and I updated it to bring it up to more recent times, and I sent it to the SAS for them to check. And they came back to me and they said, there's not enough about private soldiers in here, there's too much about officers. And I said, well, that's great. I'm really pleased to hear that. I'll now want to mention Private Jones and Private Smith. I said, no, you can't mention those names. So in the end, the names didn't appear. There are sometimes some reasons why private soldiers' names don't appear.
Thank you. I'm sorry for sticking to time. Can I comment though that what we've seen this morning is a wealth of knowledge and experience and emotion dating back decades. And I'd like to ask you, I'd thank Peter and also Michael for this morning's papers. Thank you.